Okay, I think that's it. We've got a great number of people joined here. Yeah, as I said, thanks for joining us here. We've kind of restarted our webinar series. Many of you will have remembered, hopefully, the series that we did back in the first lockdown. When we were all working from home and things were very different, and we ran a whole series of webinars then for road safety professionals where we discussed various things, lots of data related stuff if you were listening to any of mine, and in fact that was when we first started looking at the impact of the lockdowns and the pandemic on road safety. So yeah, we've run various webinars on these topics over the last 18 months. And this one is very much providing an update based on the latest information and to try and understand what's happening on the roads now. So if we go through to the next slide then, yep, we're all using Teams now instead of Zoom. Remember those good old days of Zoom? So hopefully it should all work nice and easily and everybody can access it. And, we're all just totally into Teams now, aren't we? We know how it works inside out. So yeah, please use the chat function to discuss topics as we go along. So yeah, we've enabled that for everybody so you can chat amongst yourselves, where we may even provide some answers as you go along. If you do have a specific question that you'd like to ask us, we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you just put in question in capital letters, as Steve's just done there, then Steve will know that it's a question and then he'll make a copy of that so that we know which ones we need to answer. It doesn't have all of the functionality that Zoom does. Yep, it's been recorded and we'll make it available on the website, and the PDF slides will also be emailed out to you in due course, and they'll also be on the website as well. So yeah, I'm joined on the call by Craig. Wave, Craig.
Hello.
And I've also got a pre-recording from Dan Sanders from Basemap. Unfortunately, he's actually at another conference in real life today, which is a step forward, isn't it? So yeah, he couldn't make it, but he's got a pre-recording there where we talk about how you access some of the data that we've been using to analyse what's been happening on the roads. So yes, let's get into this then. What we're going to talk about. So I'm going to cover 3 different things today. I'm going to talk about traffic levels. I'm going to talk about changes in behaviour, specifically just speed here. That's where we've got the most information. And then a light on some of the information that's just been published by DFT on road casualties. For a while, we were, looking at provisional data and things like that, but we've got the whole year's worth of information out there now so that we can look at exactly what happened in 2020 and then try and maybe at the end discuss about the kinds of risks that we think are posed on the roads now and whether anything's particularly changed with this time 2 years ago, for example. Okay, then, so traffic levels. What kind of picture are we looking at? So the picture on the left is how a lot of us viewed the first lockdown, empty streets, people cycling. Is that the kind of picture that we have on the roads? Just looking out the window here, I'm not quite sure that's what's happening. Or is it the picture that's on the right there? Are we, nose to tail with traffic jams? Possibly if you're trying to get hold of some unleaded petrol anywhere in the southeast, you might be. But I don't know if the traffic's quite as bad as it was before. So first of all, we're going to run a poll. So this is exciting new functionality. So what I'm going to do is launch this first poll and I'm going to ask you a question about what you think about vehicle traffic now versus the pandemic. So there should be 3 questions coming up on the screen, and you can choose to vote on one of them. So has vehicle traffic increased? Do you think it's more or less stayed the same, or do you think it's decreased? So you can click on one of those boxes. Hopefully, if you're all playing along on a computer, you can click on this and you can see the updates as they go along. I can see that we've already had 29 responses on there, 31. So that's more or less 80% of the people that are on the call. So let's have a look at the answers there. And we've got 33% of people thinking that vehicle traffic has increased, 42% saying that it's more or less stayed the same, and then 23% saying that it's decreased. So yeah, pretty broad mix of responses there. So now I'm going to ask you specifically about cycling, because there's been a lot of focus on cycling over the last 18 months. So again, same question. Do you think that it's increased? Do you think that it stayed the same, or do you think that it's decreased? Okay, responses rolling in pretty quickly here. Okay, I think that's more or less everybody. So we're seeing, yeah, the majority of people, 66% here saying that you think that cycling's increased. Some people saying it stayed the same, and I'm guessing there's one person that is in the 3% that has said that it's decreased. So that's interesting. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and have a look at some of the evidence about this. What data do we have that tells us whether, you know, our assumptions, our observations are actually true or not? So here's the Department for Transport data. Now, we covered this at various conferences, including joining the dots and some of our webinars in the past. And the way that this data is collected differs according to the different, the different source of information. So we've got on there, you've got cars. So you can see that you had that immediate dip in the first lockdown in the number of cars, and you can see similar pictures as well for vans, not quite as much as cars. And then you've got large good vehicles. That's not light goods vehicles, large good vehicles, which are in blue. So they didn't drop by as much in that first lockdown period. And then at the bottom, you've got buses and trains, which saw a much larger decrease. And you know, if you trace those through, you can see that those forms of public transport really haven't recovered. So you can just about see there's a solid black line there that's centered on number 1. So 1 equals pre-pandemic levels. It's actually only a 1-week baseline from March. And then the standout one, of course, is those spiky green lines, and that was collected from mobile phone data. So yeah, you can have a look at this. I downloaded it only at the weekend, and the Department for Transport are still updating this, and it's released every Wednesday, I think. So you can see where levels are more or less now versus before. So obviously that first lockdown period was very different. You know, the huge spike in cycling that we saw there, and then big drop-offs in vehicle traffic. But actually, over the last 18 months, you know, the changes haven't been as marked in the other lockdowns. You can see a little bit of a spike. So if I just put the pointer here, you know, on this period here. So this was Christmas last year. Most of you remember it. Maybe you'll have not met up with your loved ones at that time. Maybe you will have, I can't remember what the rules are, but they were rather complicated and kept changing every few minutes about how many people you're allowed to associate with. But there's a definite big drop off in that period in terms of the vehicle traffic. And then we had this, you know, lockdown 3, as I'm calling it here. But even then, you know, the levels of traffic, certainly car traffic, vans, and LGVs, and more or less back to where they were with the compared to the previous baseline. And I think if you look now at what's happening, you know, over the last 3 or 4 months, now that we've come completely out of any form of lockdown, vehicle traffic and even cycling traffic is more or less the same as it was compared to that baseline period. The only things that haven't really jumped up as much, I would say, is the bus and the car traffic, then the train usage. Yeah, car figures are a little bit below 100%, but not very significantly. So if you want to just compare September against what they were in the baseline, there we go. You can see that cars are more or less back to where they were before. We have seen an increase in vans and LGVs. Have we become more addicted to home shopping over the last 18 months? It'd be hard for me to become any more addicted to home shopping, that's for sure. And there are a high number of large good vehicles on the road network, which is a surprise given the shortage of drivers that are allegedly out there. But okay. But yeah, you've got the drop in bus and trains there. But we still do have that increase in cycling. So compared to the baseline period, we do have 8% more cycling. So I think if we're thinking about answering those poll questions that I posed just a few minutes ago by looking at some data, we can see that cars are more or less the same, but there's been a bit of an uptick in some of the vans and LGVs, and a slight but relatively sustained increase in cycling. One thing's for sure, it's definitely not at the same kind of levels that it was in that lockdown period. So something else has happened on our roads in that time period as well, something that wasn't particularly planned out well in advance, but something that certainly happened very quickly. And that was the rise of e-scooters. And unfortunately, there is no information available on total traffic by e-scooters. It's something that the Department for Transport are hoping to include within the National Travel Survey in the future. So if you assume that the baseline was zero, as it probably more or less was, as mobile e-scooter use was entirely illegal on public roads prior to any of the higher schemes, then maybe we'll see, what kind of mix we're seeing on the roads at the moment. But yeah, right now we just don't have any ideas. There may be some data that comes out of the higher schemes, but that will only be for the towns and cities where they're in place. It'd be interesting to compare those against, how much cycling and walking is taking place at the same time. So how else can we find out that kind of information? Well, video analytics could prove to be quite useful if we want to try and detect different ways that people are moving. So this is a screenshot that's come from the Vivacity website. Some of you will have come across Vivacity. I know, again, some of their work was featured at the Joining the Dots conference earlier on this year, and you can see that this is using artificial intelligence, so computer vision, to detect the types of vehicles and types of road users that are on the road network. Now, there aren't any e-scooters on there, but you may hope that at some point the technology will become advanced enough to detect what an e-scooter looks like, and that could be one way forward for trying to estimate who's using roads, but obviously only in the locations where you've got this kind of technology in place. So these are some of the types of outputs that you would expect to see by using this technology. So you've got a day-by-day analysis, and it would show, total counts for motor vehicles, total counts for cyclists, and total counts for pedestrians, and seeing them side by side, I think is really useful. One thing that we've always struggled with in road safety is to get really accurate pedestrian counts. Notice that it's actually on a different axis on the right hand side there, so it's not quite as high for cyclists and pedestrians as it looks like compared to the motor vehicles. But yeah, trying to understand how many pedestrians are really using the roads is difficult, because obviously they don't walk over sensors, you can't detect them. The only other way of doing it is using vehicle counts. I suppose the other thing to do as well is to look at the National Travel Survey, which is largely how the exposure measure is calculated for Great Britain. But I think this kind of technology gives us a real opportunity to understand how people are moving around our busy urban centres. So thinking about other data sources as well, you can use information from GPS devices. So satellite navigation systems. I mean, almost every car these days comes with a satellite navigation system. And a lot of those do collect data, harvest it, and then send it back to central, computer networks where that's processed. And we've used that ourselves to try and calculate who's using which roads the most. So if I move on to the next slide, Craig, do you want to just explain a little bit about how you have gone around to calculate traffic levels on all roads in the UK?
Yeah, sure. Apologies if this is slightly techy. I think Dan from Basemap is going to be speaking later about the data source. But yeah, so we took these telematics counts matched to road sections and matched them to just over 18,000 DFT count point locations where traffic data is known. And we used a fully Bayesian model to model AADF on all roads. So we assumed that traffic flow is Poisson distributed because it's traffic counts. We assume that the mean of this is proportional to the telematics counts that we have available, because we know there's some sort of underreporting, but it should be sort of constant across the road network. But we do allow this scaling factor to vary by types of road. So we looked at different scaling factors for single, dual carriageways, slip roads and other roads, mostly to account for things like changes in counting methodologies and matching of telematics accounts. And then we use the magic that is TensorFlow and Monte Carlo, Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling to use all of these DFT traffic accounts to sample these scaling factors. And ultimately what you get at the end is a probabilistic model of traffic flow that's based entirely on the traffic accounts from the telematics data, but that is entirely informed by the levels seen on the DFT count points. I think there's a lovely map on the next slide for people who glazed over whilst I was talking there. So everyone loves a map. So this is the result of that sort of modelling. So this is Cardiff. We're only showing roads where you've got at least 500 modelled vehicles, because below a certain point, modelling based on small telematics counts doesn't really make sense. But yeah, you can see that the higher traffic flows tend to be along these sort of more major roads, whereas the urban roads tend to have lower traffic flows. Oh, and this is from the Active Streets Assessment tool. Sorry, I'm going to try and get a plug in before Richard moves on to the next slide. It is my baby, the Active Streets Assessment tool. So it uses a huge amount of data, including all of this telematics data.
Thank you, Craig. Craig did have to sit me down at least 3 or 4 times and explain all that stuff, and I think I more or less get it now. So if you don't quite understand it, I wouldn't feel so bad. But Craig does, and that's the important thing. Okay, let's have a look at what we know about speeds then. So let's do the next poll. So do you think that vehicle speeds on the road network now versus the pre-pandemic, do you think they've increased? Do you think they've stayed the same, or do you think they've decreased? Everybody quick with the responses. Ooh, it's a tie at the moment. Exciting. Who's got the casting vote out there? And I think, oh, and it's gone back to a tie again. Well, it looks like we can't decide between us. One thing's for sure. Oh, it's gone back up to increased. Okay, yeah, so we're more or less 50-50 on increased or stayed the same. Nobody thinks that average speeds on the roads have decreased. Oh, thank you, Brian. That's the only time that statistic will ever cheer me up. Yeah, so we're more or less tied, but we definitely think that they haven't gone down. So let's just remind ourselves why we might think that vehicle speeds have increased. And if you've listened to some of my webinars or looked at some of Craig's analysis in the past, you'll remember this one. So this is what we did. We looked at, so this is average percentage over the speed limit. And we looked at, you know, that dotted line, 23rd of March, 2020, when Boris all told us to stay at home. And some people didn't, and they increased their vehicle speeds. So that was absolutely clear in all speed limits during that period. Yeah, in our analysis, we analysed to the end of May, and we were quite concerned because we thought, you know, if this kind of thing is going to continue, we're going to see much higher speeds, and inevitably there'd be higher numbers of crashes, and you'd expect crashes of higher severity. But is that what's actually happened on our road network? So fortunately, the DFT have published some more data as well on this one. So this is, again, information that you can get from their website. This actually came out in July, I think. It went reasonably under the radar, but it's a fascinating piece of analysis. If you want to look at vehicle speeds, it's actually based on some relatively small sample sizes. So there's fewer than 100 automated traffic counters that are used in this analysis, but it is reasonably consistent over the last 10 years. And for the first time ever, you know, the DFT have released this data in much more detail. They normally only do average annual figures for different vehicle types and different speed limits. But actually here, what they've done is they plotted those percentage of cars that are exceeding the speed limit and percentage of light commercial vehicles, motorcycles, and rigid heavy goods vehicles by those individual daily periods that you've effectively got in here, but then also by type of road. So we've got motorways, 70 mile per hour if you're a car, national speed limit carriageways, again 60 if you're a car, and 30 mile per hour roads, which is everybody. So those of you that have come across this information before won't be surprised to know that compliance is poorer on 30 mile per hour roads. It tends to be pretty good anyway on national speed limit single carriageways, especially for cars. Look at that, incredibly good compliance there. Obviously the HGVs have got a different speed limit that they're sticking to. But what you can see is you can see that bump, the bump that we had in the previous chart absolutely happened for April and May. But since then, we've more or less got back down to where we were before. So actually, if you compare the 2 years, and the DFT for some reason don't publish speeds, including a decimal place, so there's room for error within this. You can see that actually, if you look at the types of road on there, it's only motorways and national speed limit single carriageways that have seen an increase to 0 decimal places, certainly within the 2 periods. So we've only had an increase of 1 mile per hour on motorways and national speed limit single carriageways. But again, look at the number of sites that are involved in here. It's really not massive. What if we could, find out about that on more roads, on your roads, so that you could see specifically within any town or, interurban road, what's been happening on those roads, and see if they've changed in these 2 periods. Which does rather neatly bring me on to the next point, as you would expect. So yeah, Dan unfortunately couldn't make it to this call, but he has got a pre-record which lasts around 11 minutes. But it helps, I think, most people that wanted to use this kind of data to really understand how it's collected. So he does go into a reasonable amount of detail on that, but I think it's really worth it because it's very valuable for me and certainly for us within our team to help understand, the power of this data and how it's being used by different people. So I'm just going to move on, and you should hear Dan any second.
Excited to be here today, and I'm to speak to you all about our TM Speeds product. So I've got a few slides that talk a little bit about how the data is collected and how it's been used as well. So what is Teletrack Navman average speed data? So this is a data set that comes from GPS trackers based within vehicles themselves. It's in things such as the dashboards, sat navs, for example. It's also in things such as stolen vehicle trackers, and this data then effectively pings its location via a GPS pole and a timestamp back to a central server every second. So that's a lot of poles coming off the data. The great thing about that is the data has been collected anonymized, so people don't know they're actually supplying the data back. There's around 110,000 vehicles that are actively providing this data to Teletrack Navman at the moment, of which that makeup of devices is 90% cars, about 5% light commercial vehicles, and the rest are made up of things such as HGVs and taxis as well. Now, as you can imagine, with a 1 second poll, there's trillions of GPS raw data points that are being collected every single day. Now, these polls have been collected from all types of roads, but in a given month, 99% of motorways, A roads and B roads are collected. And this is also collected in both directions. And as the map shows just here is for a typical month what that coverage looks like. So we can see again the main kind of roads are being covered by the GPS pings and the poles. And it's things like cul-de-sacs and things like that where journeys may start or may end, where it's quite hard to collate that data. The data, as I said, comes directly from GPS trackers. No data is provided from cameras or anything like that. It's all from active GPS from devices themselves. So it's a lot of data that's collected and recorded as part of it. So after all the pings and polls have been collected, then what happens is the data needs to be converted. So in this instance, the data is converted to road links. And this is done by effectively attaching and linking all the pings or the poles together. So each vehicle has a unique ID, which is used at this stage, and they're lined up next to each other, and then the closest link is looked for it. Now, when the data is provided, generally, this is attached to the OS Master Map Highways network. So there's 5-6 million links in total across the whole of Great Britain where this is attached to. Then what happens is the time stamp is used to work out the distance between each of the pings and the poles to work out the time to traverse each of the link. And this is recording in deciseconds. Now, because this data needs to be anonymised, what happens is it's then linked into 15-minute periods for each of the links. So, for example, you may have a link, you may have 5 different vehicles going across it. So what will happen is the average time it takes to drive through that link will be recorded for 12 to 12:15 at midnight to midnight, and that's recorded then back into the database. This then goes up to 96 different time periods a day, so that's every 15 minutes, and that's recorded every day of the year. Now, some data is checked logically to make sure it makes sense. So, for example, with highways data, we've got some great routing information in there, such as banned turns or one-way streets. So anything that comes back that is routed that doesn't look to make sense, that is removed from the application as well. Max speeds are removed. So in a very small instance, you may have a stolen vehicle tracker from a vehicle that's been stolen. So that extreme kind of maximum speed is then removed from the data before it's kind of provided downstream to any users. And also with a pole every second, it's quite easy to see where a GPS may have wobbled somewhere. So what we mean here is where it's bounced off a high building or something like that and appears 200-300 a mile away where it should be. But because you've got that regular polling, it's quite easy to spot that and remove that data. And then effectively you've just got 2 seconds between the poles, which again is more than accurate enough to provide a time it takes to traverse through that link. So again, here on the right hand side, it's another area is looking at where there's data provided for a 1 month period. So again, seeing lots of good detail on the roads and the highways network just there. So how then do we create the average speeds from that? So we have lots of data now that's been summarized into 15-minute periods. We've got the counts that are associated with them 15-minute periods as well. And we've got a unique link ID that's provided. So what we can then do is we can process that data based on a few characters, such as what day of the week it is. So a popular one could be an AM peak time between 7 AM and 9 AM. So we can look at the 8 different time periods as part of that. We can add them up and then work out the counts and work out the speed based on that. Obviously, we're converting the time to a speed in this instance as well. And also we can specify other things such as date ranges and things like that. So by default, the data runs from the 1st of April to the 31st of March, which runs across the financial year as part of it. As part of creating the average speed, we put a few more rules in there as well. So we can do the maximum speed per road type. So, for example, we have a cutoff of 160 kilometers an hour. There should be no speeds greater than that. On some motorways at midnight, we've got a few that maybe get a bit close to that, but generally everything's far below there. And we can also specify the minimum number of counts on a link. So by default, we may set that to be 10 on some of our minor roads. We may set that to be a bit higher on the major roads. And that effectively means for, say, between 7 and 9 in the morning, we need at least 10 counts on that link. So we create then a base TM Speeds product. This is the one that's used by partners, it's resold by Ordnance Survey. And in this data itself, there's 14 billion summarized link values. So what does that actually mean? So if you've got 5 or 6 million links, we've then got 14 billion counts recorded against those links across a year period. The great thing about this data as well is because we're getting this regular polling, we can provide a speed in both directions. Obviously, if the road is a bi-directional road, if it's a one-way road, we'll only have the speeds going in one way. And things such as dual carriageways and motorways are generally selected as a different link per direction. So as mentioned, this data is resold by Ordnance Survey and many partners as well. But because we've got the 99% coverage on our major roads, there are roads that aren't covered across the 12-month period. Some very, very rural C classification of roads, things such as cul-de-sacs. So then what we can do is we'll infill that data. So our commitment is to provide 100% coverage of data across the whole network. And where we don't have that data, we can use some clever things to work out what the speed is likely to be. So the first thing will be if we've got speeds going in one direction, so the A side, in the way that the link was originally digitized, we can use that speed for the reverse speed. If we don't have that, what we can then look at doing is creating an average speed based on the road type. So is it a minor road? Is it a motorway? Is it a local road? So we can then effectively, on the minor roads or the cul-de-sacs, we can look at within a 1 kilometre grid and work out the average speed to that as well. And then we can factor that up. So in places like rural Scotland, you may only have one link within that kilometre grid. So we then may look at the 2 kilometre grid closest to it, and so on and so forth until we get 100% coverage of the data. We can also provide accounts of data, so we can work out actually where the data has been infilled or where effectively it's been derived from real GPS values. As it's been really, really popular, it's a really trusted data set out in the public. And so we've got a fair different uses of it. So we produced a product called Highways Analyst. Highways Analyst is a desktop, so it's a web application that we can load all this data in, which can be quite hard to query on a desktop. And we can effectively then put in custom dates, custom ranges in there. And this effectively allows us then to get the average speed or average time or minimum or maximum or the 85th percentile out of the system. This allows then a user that's typically a highways authorities to monitor their network for changes. If you put a bus lane in or change a signal prioritization somewhere, you can see the before and after, or just see where people are rat running and things like that. This is used quite extensively, and the data can be exported out to things such as CSV or shapefiles, and allows people yet to query that 14 billion counts of data. The actual data can also be used by people like the Department for Transport or Highways England to look at large-scale transport models. It's been used by the Department for Transport for the last 15 years and supplied out for free to local authorities up to March of this year. And it's been trusted to make some quite large decisions off the back of things. More recently, it was used by the NHS to plan the vaccine rollout. If you want to have more information on that, we've got a great case study on the BaseMap website. And it was effectively used to work out where vaccination centres should be and to ensure people would be no more than about a 10-minute drive to their closest vaccination centre. And again, that was a great thing to be able to help out with. The average speed data is also resold, as I said, by Ordnance Survey and other people as well. And there's many different clients that use it. So in the private sector, we've got, for example, national parcel and postal delivery companies that are using it for routing purposes. We've got local authorities and the NHS and other public sector organisations using it to work out what the speed is like on a road and to work out things such as congestion and emissions based off that. And it's also really important in things such as control centres. So it's used quite a lot in emergency centres for dispatch of blue light vehicles to work out actually what's the right centre to dispatch something from, for example, in the fire service. And it's been a real kind of growth area that these kind of organisations are trusting the TM speed data to help people and to help save lives, which is a great quote we've got just here that it's always worthwhile kind of throwing in. So the data itself is updated annually. It's released out to partners. It's a great, accurate data set it's helping people make informed and intelligent decisions kind of going forwards. And I hope that's a quick overview of the TM speed data. I've just provided my details here. Again, apologies for not being able to make it, but if you have any sort of questions about the data, do please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully that's answered almost every question you could possibly have about the data. One important thing that Dan didn't mention in there is the annual periods that are used. So I was initially quite annoyed when I found out that it went from business year to business year, so starting on April the 1st. But when you have a pandemic that aligns slightly with the end of a business year and the lockdown that happened on the 23rd of March, actually, it's provided a really good opportunity for us to have a look at before and after. So just before Dan did his presentation, I talked about the DFT data and using 100 different count point locations. Now let's have a look at all of the roads. So this is a bit of an exclusive. This result hasn't been shown before, and let's just check out and see what's happening. Now, because we work with BaseMap, we've managed to get 85th percentile speed as well as average speed. So here it is. We have seen some increases in average speed. So if you look 40 mile per hour limits, slight increase there, 50, even slighter increase around 0.25 miles per hour, 60 mile per hour national speed limits. There could be some 60 mile per hour dual carriageways in there, of course, but there's not too many of those around the country. A 1 mile per hour average speed there, and then a slightly lower increase in speeds on 70 mile per hour roads. But interestingly, surprisingly or not, the 85th percentile speeds haven't increased or virtually not increased at all. And in fact, they're down on many different roads, which is kind of indicating that one special 2-month period of lockdown 1 is not what we saw throughout the rest of the year. And it is something that almost certainly isn't in place now. Now, there may be people on this call that have more access to local information about enforcement rates and things like that, and offending rates, and it'd be interesting to see those kinds of things. But I think, you know, we can't think that we're now somehow, you know, in this forever lockdown period where speeds are high, the level of cycling's through the roof as well. We're getting much more back to a normal that is quite similar to how it was before. So what's been happening in terms of road casualties then? So let's do another poll. This is the final poll. So this one's going to ask you whether you think that now versus pre-pandemic, have the roads got safer? Has road safety level stayed the same, or have the roads become more dangerous? So the roads safer, more dangerous, or more or less the same? Okay, we've got quite a good number of responses in here. It looks like we're going to end up with stayed the same being the most common answer. Yep. So majority of you, 62% there, saying that road safety has more or less stayed the same. So yeah, let's go and have a look at some stats from the DFT that were published last week and then see what they've got to say about it. So again, you know, the DFT have, you know, really paid attention to the fact that last year was a very different year, and they published some information and they put in those lockdown periods. Now, obviously, we had lockdown in the UK at the beginning, then we had mini lockdowns, different national lockdowns, different types of lockdowns, different restrictions and things like that. So it all gets a little bit fuzzy as we get later on in the year. I think one thing that was really consistent was from January 2021 onwards, there was pretty much a hard lockdown across almost the whole of the UK, but we don't have that data yet, and it might be another year before we see that. Okay, but yeah, you can see that there is that big drop in vehicle traffic, so that's the dark green line there, and the drop in casualties at the same time, and they more or less matched up with each other, at least in terms of all casualties. When you start to look at different levels of severity, it wasn't quite the same picture though. So we didn't see as big a drop in the percentage of fatal collisions, for example. So yeah, they didn't have those great big reductions. DFT also did some breakdowns looking by type of vehicle, and motorcyclists didn't see as big a drop, for example, as car occupants. Pedestrians dropped the most, and pedal cycles, you know, even saw an increase in the percentage changes for some periods. It was actually in that kind of, you know, post lockdown one period and into the autumn this time last year, where there were some slightly higher increased numbers there. But even when everybody was cycling and walking in April and May last year, there wasn't actually as big an increase. And this is where you really need to start thinking about, you know, the level of cycling that was taking place out there. So going back to, you know, that first chart I showed you with the green lines that showed the level of people that are walking and cycling and using cars, etc. You know, if we want to look at the level of safety, we need some kind of rate measure. There were some interesting results in there in terms of gender. So we saw that there was a larger reduction in female casualties rather than male casualties. I can only assume this is related to, you know, levels of exposure, and that, you know, there was a more imbalance in the number of women who were maybe not going out and using the roads during that pandemic period. Even afterwards, that seems to have persisted, which is very interesting to see. And then looking by age groups, we saw a large drop in the older casualties. A lot of those would have been isolating at home, of course. Child casualties, a lot of them homeschooling, of course. And it was in the adult kind of mid-age band, you know, 25 to 59-year-old, that saw the least change out of those different bands. But yeah, as I mentioned, if you want to consider the level of road safety, you actually need to start looking at a rate to consider, you know, how that's compared to the traffic. And although 3 of those charts on there are really good because it's showing that slight injury rates, serious injury rates, and overall total casualty rates have reduced and reduced year on year, the fatality rate actually increased. So based on the amount of traffic, the roads in terms of death actually became 5% more dangerous. Okay, I'm going to use that measure. So yeah, 5% increase in fatality rates on the roads, which might be a surprise, but actually, if you look at what's happened in other Western countries, other European countries, they've seen similar kinds of figures as well. How much of that is due to changes in road use or any of that, that one-off spike in speeds? I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of, but I'm sure, many of us on this call will be interested in finding out why that did take place, and especially whether that's likely to be something that does persist. If we're looking at cycling safety, though, we can see that actually this was the one good news story. Yes, I know that there was an increase in the number of cyclist fatalities on the roads, and nobody ever wants to see an increase in those numbers. But relative to the amount of cycle traffic that was out on the roads, it did actually get safer. Only a tiny little bit, but you can see that the serious and slight rates dropped off quite significantly, and even the killed rate did drop a little bit. So for cyclists, I would say that the roads objectively got more safe, even though there were a higher number of fatalities. But for generally other road users, because the fatality rate went up, you could argue that it became less safe. But going back to our e-scooters, the group that we know very little about, what happened to them? There's been a lot of concern about them. There's a lot of information that we don't have, but I'm really happy that the DFT have done a great job of trawling through some text descriptions within the other vehicle category, and they pulled out collisions and casualties that involved e-scooter use. So you can see on here that January, February, March, and then April, when there's very little e-scooter use, certainly no legal e-scooter use on the public roads, those numbers were really small. But then, with the advent of the hire schemes, or possibly an increase in the number of private scooter use, and that's the problem. We don't know where. We don't know whether it was on a hire scheme or not. You can see that there was big increases. I mean, even into December as well, whether that's related to Christmas and everybody getting one from Santa, I'm not quite sure. But there were certainly large increases there. But got to bear in mind that these are still a fraction of the number of casualties that you get on pedal cycles. I estimate that it's still probably only around 2%, even for December. So although e-scooters are this new emerging trend that many of us are concerned about, the numbers relative to other forms of transports are still quite low. But we need to find out more information, and we need that kind of exposure data. So whether we rely on those AI cameras or not, I'm not sure. So there's a couple of questions if you haven't asked them already. I know we've seen some coming through. Just think about these. So, have you noticed road use patterns that have changed significantly? Do you disagree with some of the information that's on there? Have you got your own data that you've been recording and looking at? Do you think there's any other road user behaviours that have changed? So we talked about speed and that blip that we had in the first lockdown of the rapid increase in speeds. How are road risks evolving? Are e-scooters a slight amount of more cycling, perhaps more walking? We don't know until the NTS data comes out. Are those subtle changes going to be enough to change how we as professionals think about tackling road safety? And what does any of this mean for you? Is it business as usual? Is it the same thing? Do we need to do more to increase more cycling or walking or even e-scooter levels? How are you going to be using some of this data? So some of that data that Dan demonstrated, are you going to be trying to understand what's been happening in terms of changes of flow and speeds on your roads? Certainly that's something that we've been working on with local authorities to provide them maps. The great thing about having that pre-COVID data gives you a kind of a time machine, not in a cool Doctor Who kind of way, but it's an opportunity for you to go back and have a look what traffic and speed levels were back in the past, even though you hadn't put in an ATC or a SID or something like that, you've got some, reasonably accurate derived data there from some telematics that might give you a bit of information. So before I get onto the questions, I'm just going to do a bit of a plug for some of the other webinars that we've got coming up. So next week, we're going to be doing the first in the series of what works and what does not work in road safety. So this is based on an international report that was published earlier on this year that talks about what does work. I have the pleasure of doing the what does work one. So talking about the interventions where there's really good evidence for reducing casualties. What Works Part 2, which is taking place in November, hosted by my colleagues Dan and Tanya, is going to be talking about what doesn't work. And I suggest that that one is definitely worth tuning in for. We've also got another one on new ways of accessing road safety data. So if you're interested in some of the more data side of things, as I am on Craig is, then you might want to tune in for that one or nominate your analyst to attend. And then Dan's also doing one on the second decade of action for road safety, which is seeing 50% casualty reduction targets by 2030. And hopefully that's going to give us all a really big boost in the sector to try and push on with our important work. Those are our contact details there. You'll all get a copy of these slides. You can Google us, find us out on the website. Dan Saunders' details are there as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop presenting now and going to have a look at some of the questions that have been coming through, hopefully. Have you seen anything that you particularly like on the list there, Craig?
So Caroline Nash has asked whether mobile phone data could confuse e-scooters with cycle traffic, which is a good point. So the mode detection algorithms I've seen from people like Google at data science conventions, they tend to use basically the speeds of the vehicles and the movements real time. And so, yeah, anything that moves like a cycle will be recorded as a cycle. So I can imagine that e-scooters will just disappear into cycle traffic.
Yes, I wouldn't have thought that'd be a huge issue if there are only small numbers, as if it's around this 2% figure. I'm only guessing the 2% figure based on the casualty data, because I've not seen anybody that's produced traffic mix totals, but you would expect that over time that they would infiltrate that cycling data. I think there still is a question about the use of that cycling data. How accurate is it to use mobile phone signals? Something about it just sits a little bit uncertain with me. I'd much rather use, the kind of AI approach that you saw on there, which is about detecting bicycles on the screen. That's to me seems like a more accurate way of doing it. But then, of course, you've got to put them in place and pay to have them done, and getting the before and after is going to be quite tricky as well. Did you have more questions up there, Craig?
Yeah, so Michelle Little's asked if DFT counters cover the whole of the UK.
Oh, well, you can answer this one as you're the one that deals with the data. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know they cover GB. I don't know what the coverage of traffic counters is like in Northern Ireland.
I'm pretty sure there aren't any that are published there. Maybe published separately by Northern Ireland government.
But yeah, there's a wide range of DFT counters. They cover a huge amount of motorway and B roads, but there's also been a huge push to cover more minor roads in recent years. So I think the number of DFT count points went up at the start of the pandemic, but I don't know if that's going to continue.
Have we got any more up there?
Yeah, so Andrew Blackburn's asked how skewed the GPS data is. So this may be a question for Dan at Basemap. So he said that there's a tendency to use GPS on unfamiliar roads versus driving quicker on familiar routes and journeys. Does the GPS track all journeys?
Yeah, so the GPS data does track all journeys. Now, I think Dan mentioned the sample size, which was pretty large. It was well over 100,000. So, yeah, it will tend to cover the routes that people tend to cover the most. So you would think that the majority of those journeys are on more familiar roads closer to home. Are people more likely to speed on roads closer to home or further away from home? You would hope that because there's a large enough sample size that would all even itself out on there. And certainly when we look at some of the outputs, sometimes you do see some spikes within there that are possibly due to, if you have a service road by the side of a main road, sometimes it will pick up some vehicle speeds there. But by and large, as long as you treat it as an overall assessment tool, we think the data works pretty well on that. And there's lots of different people that are using this for lots of different technologies. I mean, it's been around, the DFT have been purchasing it for the last 10-15 years. I know that Dan and his team at Basemap do a lot of work on trying to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. Craig and I are always talking to them about any anomalies that any of our clients see on it. So I think, it doesn't replace an ATC, but then it doesn't cost anywhere near as much as an ATC. And again, I think it's really good for those kind of triage tasks to give you an idea of what's going on an individual road. If you're doing a major change or something like that, putting in some kind of highway engineering or enforcement solution, you might want to get a full-blown survey as well, because that'll give you the time of day information too, which is really important.
So Brian has asked whether these are going to be biased towards more modern phones or vehicles.
So it's only vehicle based. It's not mobile phone based. It's not telematics based. It will only be certain types of vehicles. So I'm pretty sure it comes from one of the French vehicle manufacturers. I can't remember which one. I wouldn't swear to it live on the webinar. But yeah, and a lot of these tracker devices in there as well. So yeah, whether Citroens or Renaults are more modern than any other, I'm not quite sure. I think they're there might be some regional differences, I suppose, but yeah, it's hard to really understand that. Sorry. Richard put one there. So Richard put in a statement, says that it seems that November had dropped so much for e-scooter casualties. Do we know why? I suspect that might have been that second brief lockdown that we had for 28 days. That would possibly have impacted on it. At least, yeah, that's what I'm going with. Andrew Blackburn's also asked whether this will be offered on demand. Craig, what do you think Andrew means by that?
Oh, I assume he means the streaming of this webinar, i.e., is there a Agilysys player in which he can watch this back later? I assume that's what the question means.
Oh yeah, we'll be as with all of our webinars, you can go watch the 50 odd that we did last year. You can go back and watch them.
Or almost compete with Netflix with the number of webinars we've got on there.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions that came in before the webinar for people who unfortunately couldn't make it. So somebody asked whether the data's free to access if they're a public body or a charity. So unfortunately, you do need to pay for the data at present. That may change at some point in the future. So some of you may be aware of this thing called the Public Sector Geospatial Agreement that replaced the Public Sector Mapping Agreement. And that covers a lot of the Ordnance Survey data. So if you're in the public sector but not a charity, you do get free access to a lot of Ordnance Survey products. The speed data and the speed limit data that sits underneath it, that of course you need to know if you want to do any of that kind of analysis, isn't currently included within that. So local authorities can buy it on their own. So I think, yeah, we've as Ordnance Survey resellers supplied that to people. And I know there's a couple of large county authorities in the southeast and east of England who've bought it themselves, and they've used it internally to try and develop their own platforms to use it in their own analysis. And that's great if you've got lots of geospatial experts that can use the data and build systems. For other people, we've supplied it to them and you just bundle it as part of a product fee or something like that. But it's normally less than £1,000 for up to about 10 users for most local authorities. So it's not too much money. And again, compare that with the cost of some of the traffic counters. For the likes of Brian Lawton, who I know is on this call, I'm afraid, yeah, charities aren't included within that. So lobby your MP for inclusion in the public sector geospatial agreement. Because I think it'd be really great if, you know, more research organisations had access to this, so they could really they can do some of this more independent analysis as well.
Speaking of Brian, he's actually raised a really good question about the e-scooters. So he's asking about the split between e-scooter casualties and casualties caused by e-scooters. And that relates to another question I've had anonymously that asks whether these are e-scooter casualties we were looking at before, or casualties involved in collisions
They are.
that involved
No,
e-scooters.
these are, and I'm 99% sure, e-scooter casualties. However, Bruce Walton, who many of you know, my colleague here, has let me know that DFT will be providing the matched e-scooter casualty data for us when we do our MAST updates. So many of you know MAST Online. So that means that we will be able to look at crashes involving e-scooters, look at what e-scooters, yeah, so let's assume that there's lots of crashes that involve e-scooters hitting pedestrians. I've no evidence for that, but you'd be able to have a look at that involvement rates, and that's actually something that, you know, PACTs have done a lot of work on over the last couple of years, looking at the relationships between the vehicles and the non-motorized vehicles, cyclists, and who they end up injuring. So they did a really good report on that last year. We provided a bespoke version of Crash Map for them so that people can have a look at that, and yeah, we will be able to, in theory, have a look at an e-scooter category in that too, but with only 80 or 90 collisions in there, I'm not quite sure how useful it'll be this year. But yeah, maybe I'll put a blog on the website when we've got the data processed through MAST in the next few weeks. Okay, we are now up on time. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. Thank you for the questions. If there's any more, just drop us a line. If you'd like to know more about Craig's algorithms, he's happy to talk for days to you about that. And if you wanted to see any of the that kind of data that's available within your local area, you can actually get a demo license from Ordnance Survey to have a look at that, and I'm more than happy to show people that kind of information. But yeah, thanks for attending. I'm sure you're all off next to your next Teams meeting or wherever it may be, and hopefully see you on next week's webinar, same time, same place. Thank you very much.
Thanks.